Hello there friends, Ian here. This week, just like last week, we are going to be talking about point of view, or perspective. Last week we went into first person perspective, and this week we're going to move to the third person, and there are multiple forms. For today we are going to be talking about third person omniscient point of view. Third person omniscient uses the pronouns he, she, they, and more, and this gives you the most freedom out of any of the other perspectives. The characters are not narrating themselves here. An outside narrator is talking you through the story that is taking part. If cameras could go inside people's heads to see what they were thinking, then that's what third person omniscient would be. Looking at the person and seeing their feelings. But they're also all knowing. It's not just one character or one place you know. In third person omniscient, the narrator knows everything. This perspective, unlike first person, is very heavily plot based. Usually, it's more plot based than character based like first person is. With that being said, let's get into it. We're going to go through this the same way we did when we talked about first person, and that's with the pros and cons, tips on how to write third person omniscient, and then some examples of third person omniscient. Third person omniscient has fallen out of favor of a lot of people over recent decades, and third person limited or first person has taken over the spotlight completely. It is, besides second person, the most uncommon you can find in literature and writing today. However, it was very popular in the past. Anyway, let's get into the pros and cons of writing third person omniscient. The first pro of writing this perspective is that it allows the most freedom. I talked about this only a couple minutes ago, but writing in third person omniscient gives you the most freedom you can have in writing. You can look in every single person's head. You can talk about how they feel and all this stuff. Make sure it's in the narrator's voice, not the character's voice. You can talk about more things that the characters don't even know, because the narrator is the one that knows what's happening and can change things to be how it needs to be. If you're looking for the most freedom to be able to write anything you want without the limitations of first person or third person limited, then this might be the perspective for you. The next good thing about writing in third person omniscient is that it allows for full objectivity. You don't get the biases that a character might have that could change how the story comes out. The narrator tells everything. There's no bias because the narrator is not one of the characters. The narrator can say anything they want, and instead of having some sorts of subjectivity, it's all objective. It's told how it is. The next good thing about third person omniscient is that you can summon suspense from nothing. Suspense is very hard to come by in books when you're writing. Third person omniscient can fix that, you just have to be careful. You can use things like dramatic irony, which is where the reader knows what's happening, but the characters don't. The tension might rise because the reader doesn't know if the character is going to be able to leave in time. If you want lots of dramatic irony, look at third person omniscient. The first bad thing about writing in third person omniscient is that it is extremely easy to head hop. The line between third person omniscient and head hopping can be very blurry and hard to notice. If you're not careful, you can start head hopping. And like I said in the previous video, head hopping is when you switch character perspectives far too much. So in third person omniscient, you know everything, right? The narrator knows everything, but you just have to be careful not to head hop, because that is going to not make people enjoy your story. Head hopping, like I said, is very jarring, Not as much in third person omniscient as first person, but it's still something you have to be very careful of. The next bad thing is that this perspective brings you the farthest away from your characters. You don't really get to know them on a personal level like you do in first person and third person limited. This makes it a lot less intimate, makes it a lot more difficult for you to get readers to have a personal attachment to your characters. Having all this freedom is also sort of a curse, because if you write in third person omniscient, your writing might feel clunky and cluttered with all the information you're putting in. If you add too much information into the story, you're just going to lose the reader. You're gonna be all over the place and you're not gonna make much sense. So just make sure you aren't putting too much information into your story, and this should be easily avoidable. Now, I'm going to be giving you some tips to hopefully get you started in third person omniscient. I said earlier that you can make suspense out of thin air with this perspective. However, it's also very possible to lose it. You want to withhold some information from the reader. If you give the reader all the details they need, the suspense is gone. You're also going to want to establish your or the narrator's voice very early and very quickly, probably within the first few paragraphs. The narrator, like the characters, will have their own voice. The narrator is, so they need their own voice. The narrator might have a little bit of humor or might interject with his own thoughts or feelings about what's going on at some points. And this is part of making their voice. Just like in first person, if the voice is not interesting, you will lose people and they will stop reading. You also want to use consistent tone throughout. If your tone is not consistent, then you really reach the same problems that you reach without giving a character a voice or having things jump around too much. If the tone shifts too much, the readers might not know what the actual feel you're trying to make with this story. So just make sure you consistently use the same tone that the narrator uses throughout the entirety of your narrative. So you're not going to want to switch point of view too often. At minimum, every scene. At most, switch every scene. Yes, you're not exactly in one person's head, but you still have a character you follow throughout that scene or chapter more than the others. And that's what I would consider your point of view character for that scene or chapter. Just make sure you're not skipping over everything or head hopping like we discussed earlier. You also do not want to overwhelm your reader. Overwhelming your reader will make them turn off the book or will make them close the app or close the book. Just make sure you have everything at a good pace, and you shouldn't have a hard time doing that stuff. Before we end this video off, I have 3 examples of books written in third person omniscient. All of these were written before the 2000s as far as I'm aware. Maybe I'm wrong about one of them, but I think they were all written before the 2000s, which I couldn't really find many that were pretty recent. There are some, but it's not nearly as much as it used to be. The first example is Good Omens by Neil Gaiman and Terry Pratchett. 2 of them lurked in the ruined graveyard. 2 shadowy figures, one hunched and squat, the other lean and menacing. Both of them Olympic-grade lurkers. If Bruce Springsteen had ever recorded Born to Lurk, these 2 would have been on the album cover. This is third person omniscient because 1, it's not being told through a character, and 2, we're being told of 2 shadowy figures lurking in the shadows, and we know exactly how they are standing there. someone being able to see them in the shadows wouldn't really be able to tell you exactly how they're sitting there. The next example I have is Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen. This one was written all the way back in the 1800s. Occupied in observing Mr. Bingley's attention to her sister, Elizabeth was far from suspecting that she was herself becoming an object of some interest in the eyes of his friend. Here we get to see the narrator talk about what's in Elizabeth's head without her actually knowing what's going on in her head. And that is something you can do very successfully in third-person omniscient point of view. The next example I have is Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy by Douglas Adams. This planet has, or rather had, a problem, which was this. Most of the people living on it were unhappy for pretty much of the time. Many solutions were suggested for this problem, but most of these were largely concerned with movements of small green pieces of paper, which is odd because on the whole, it wasn't the small green pieces of paper that were unhappy. This excerpt from the beginning of Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy talks about most of the people on the planet. So that brings about the narrator knowing almost everyone on the planet was unhappy. And you also get to see what a third-person omniscient narrator can do by adding that little bit about the small green pieces of paper. A writing exercise you can do regarding third-person omniscient is sort of like what you can do with first-person. Make a few characters. With this, you don't have to make their voices so incredibly different, but it's a good practice to do that when creating your characters. So pick a setting, pick an item, pick a time of day, okay? Write 500 words in third-person omniscient with your characters and try to get what third-person omniscient is about in your writing. Of course, if this writing exercise is not right for you, don't force yourself into doing it. Do what works for you. This is just a suggestion. And that's it. That's everything you need to know on writing third-person omniscient. Third-person omniscient is very free, and it allows you to do a lot more than what other perspectives might allow you to do, with some other drawbacks. Comment below what your favorite part of third-person omniscient is and how I can improve these videos for you in the future. I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day, and I'll see you next week. Bye!